Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm John Bansemer, and I'm the director of the CyberAI project here at the Center for Security and Emerging Technology at Georgetown University. Today, we're here to discuss the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, or PCAST, which is what we'll use for the rest of the discussion today, their report to the President called The Strategy for Cyber Physical Resilience, Fortifying Our Critical Infrastructure for a Digital World. This report, released in February of this year, provides detailed recommendations to increase the resilience of these critical systems. And we are pleased to be joined by members of the PCAST working group that produced this report. For those of you that may be unfamiliar with the PCAST, it is the sole body of advisors from outside the federal government charged with making science, technology, and innovation policy recommendations to the President and the White House. It's established by executive order, and it's an independent federal advisory committee comprised of distinguished individuals from industry, academia, and nonprofit organizations with a range of perspectives and expertise. In a moment, I'll bring our panel of experts on screen for this discussion. But first, let me just share a few logistical points. All attendees' microphones are muted. If you're on a computer and experience any technical issues, use the chat function at the bottom of your screen to alert us, and a CSET team member will try to help you out. Our goal here today is to have an open and engaging dialogue. So as questions come to mind while our experts are getting us started, please begin sharing these questions and comments in the chat, and we'll do our very best to cover as many of those questions as we can. And now let me introduce our panelists. First, Dr. Eric Horvitz is a computer scientist and a leading researcher in artificial intelligence. Beyond principles and applications of AI, he has studied rising opportunities and challenges at the intersection of technology, people, and society, including the promise of AI and the sciences and national security issues presented by AI's issues. Our next panelist is Dr. Georgiana George Shea. She is a highly respected computer scientist and cybersecurity leader with a remarkable history of leading national security initiatives within the Department of Defense and across the federal government. Her deep expertise has played a critical role in strengthening critical infrastructure against cyber attacks, protecting vital systems, and ultimately bolstering our national security. Finally, Dr. Phil Venables is a computer scientist, software engineer, and an expert in technology, security, and enterprise risk, who has founded and led multiple corporate and industry-wide security initiatives focused on safeguarding critical infrastructure in the financial sector. We are enormously gratified that you could all join us. I'd like to start today's session by hearing from each of our panelists about the report. So first, I think I'll turn to Eric to get us started, and maybe you could describe a little bit of the impetus for the report and then just kind of start guiding us through it. Over to you.
Well, thanks, John. And John asked us to share a bit of background on even our personal interest in the formulation of the study. So I've long been interested in principles of robustness, flexibility, and resiliency. This happened to be the foundation of my doctoral work in AI. I was building systems back then that could do well amidst the complexity of the open world, including machinery centering on the graceful degradation of performance. So shortly after the current PCAST was organized, Phil and I each independently proposed to the PCAST co-chairs that we needed to do a deep dive study into resiliency of our nation's critical infrastructure. We needed to move beyond sole focus on cybersecurity and to shift our thinking towards resiliency and survival to adversarial attacks, failures of various kinds, errors, and even natural disasters. We both saw that there was much opportunity for bolstering resiliency and that it would take not just technical, but socio-technical, organizational, and policy-centric innovations. So as we launched the study on cyber-physical resilience, we brought together a strong team of experts, including several members of the larger PCAST group, and our external experts, including George Shea, who's with us today, Richard Danzig, Kevin Fu, Dan Gare, and others. So as some background here, our society is increasingly dependent on an interconnected set of digital and physical technologies. And despite advancements in cybersecurity, cyber attacks, natural threats, errors, and accidents continue to put these services at risk. And progress has been made in enhancing cybersecurity, but we know that our adversaries are relentless, and attacks will no doubt continue to penetrate and compromise our systems in the future. Also, various failures, errors, and natural disasters have widespread effects, as we saw just last week with CrowdStrike. Now, we highlighted several incidents in our report. All are very interesting studies, and it's unfortunate that we keep on seeing incidents that add to our list. We talked about the Texas electric grid failures during a cold snap, the Colonial Pipeline incident, even an FAA computer maintenance error that grounded thousands of flights across the United States. And of course, we've had a number of striking incidents since the report was published. So our goal is to assess the current situation and to make recommendations to fortify the resilience of our critical infrastructure against threats, and ensuring that we can maintain minimal viable services during attacks or failures. So we focus on bolstering the resiliency of cyber physical systems. These systems rely critically on both physical and computational components to perform their services. They integrate physical components and processes with digital technologies, including sensors, actuators, computation of status and settings and controls, storage and communications, and the communications are typically dependent on local and internet connectivity. We assessed that over the last 25 years or so, cyber and physical systems have become so deeply interwoven with the digitalization of our critical infrastructure across the United States and the world. So today, our critical infrastructure for water, energy, healthcare, communications, banking, transportation, and defense is cyber physical. And while the digitization has been valuable, we get increasing performance and responsiveness, finer grade controls, ongoing monitoring and tracking into the health of our systems. It creates new challenges. The infrastructure relies now on complex assemblies of digital and physical components with often poorly characterized interdependencies. They present wide attack surfaces, multiple failure modes, and we point out that their complexity can make it challenging to understand the implications of specific failures on overall system operation and service delivery. And we'd like to basically understand, even in a degraded state, how we can best respond, repair, or restart systems. So in our report, we provide sets of recommendations to enhance capabilities that enable us to anticipate, withstand, and recover from, as well as adapt to cyber attacks, as well as natural or accidental disruptions. The goal is to ensure that our infrastructure remains resilient despite compromises. So our first set of recommendations is to establish and report on sector-specific performance goals that center on resilience. We recommend that each sector sets what we refer to as minimum viable operating capabilities, as well as minimum delivery objectives. And here's an example of a minimum viable delivery objective. It's a measure we refer to as bounded impact, which states the influence of failures on people and their durations. So for example, no more than 50,000 people will be without water or electricity for more than 1 week. To make that a commitment and an assertion and a proof. We also ask for the establishment of leading indicators to capture attributes of resiliency for critical systems. We provide a list that captures directions for these measures. Some are North Stars and some are quite feasible. Examples of leading indicators include internet denial. Just cut the internet, what happens with the service? Hard restart recovery time. You have to reboot the whole water system to provide clean water to a city. How long does that take? A measure of the ability to fail over to manual operations. And then more sophisticated indicators like a measure we call cyber physical modularity, which is the mean number of component failures that flow from single failures based on a consideration of cascades of sets of failure modes. With that, let me turn things over to Phil to continue to progress us through the report for recommendations.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Eric. So, I mean, just building and amplifying on some of the things that Eric said, I think, the tone of the report overall, and I think many of you in the audience today will probably get this, but something that we need to keep educating society more broadly is that no matter how well we do to secure or defend any particular component or system, no matter how well we do, something is always going to break, some attack is always going to succeed. So it's important to work under the assumption that security or failure is going to happen. And then how do we sustain the overall resiliency of the wider system to deliver those minimum viable operating capabilities for a particular function or critical infrastructure service? The FAA example that Eric mentioned, where back in early last year, there was a single FAA system outage that grounded most North American commercial aviation for a better part of a day, was an individual system that went down. And what was interesting is after that happened, there was many calls that basically said, let's make sure that system never, ever fails again. Now, we all know that's probably going to be futile. The right question, and what we're trying to get to in the PCAST report, is to say, why is it that everything is dependent on that one system and there's no alternative means of sustaining service in the event of the inevitability of that one system going down? And all of the recommendations we have kind of build on this theme of how to absolutely assure that certain minimum viable goals can always be met under a wider array of perhaps more difficult scenarios. So as we go into the report, we look at a number of different recommendations, and a lot of it's also focused on how do we improve the ability of our public sector organizations and our private sector organizations to deliver more and more resiliency capability for the nation. Now, we're very, very careful to call out and say that all of the work in many government departments, agencies, private sector organizations, it's all individually great work done by very committed and talented individuals. But when the report, we say this collectively doesn't quite add up to what we need to do. So this is not an individual function problem, it's a collective problem. And one of the things we kind of talk a lot in the report is both in the public and private sector, there's often great tone at the top. So in other words, executive leaders espousing the need for better security, better resilience, but that tone at the top is not always connected with the resources in the ranks to actually get that job done. And so a lot of the recommendations in the report are about making sure that, for example, sector risk management agencies have a lot more capabilities to discharge their responsibilities in their sector. Some agencies are doing amazing jobs and are very well resourced. Other agencies haven't been given the resources they need to do to achieve their objective. And then similarly in the private sector, there are entities called sector coordinating councils across each of the critical infrastructure sectors. Some of those have been tremendously successful, and especially so since they've had CEO level engagement in driving forward critical resilience efforts in that sector. Some others have been less so because they've suffered from the lack of that senior engagement. And the recommendations call out that need to connect the tone at the top with resources in the ranks to get these actual capabilities built. And then building again on what Eric said is one of the things that I think is for me is one of the foundational parts of the report is thinking about these leading indicators of performance. Many cyber performance goals and cyber resilience performance goals have often historically been expressed as lagging indicators. Number of bad events that have happened, number of malware events, number of ransomware events, number of outages. And in reality, what we need to do is shift more towards leading indicators. The analogy I always use is if you're a manufacturing production line, it's important to monitor the quality of what comes off the production line. But what most organizations do that are successful is they monitor the inputs, the quality of the raw materials, the quality of the manufacturing process, the quality of the safety and QA reviews. And then in doing that, they almost can't help but have a good result in the end. And so in the list and some of the examples that Eric gave, it's about defining leading indicators that if organizations implement those, whether it's the ability to improve software reproducibility, to confirm that they can run critical operations in the temporary absence of the internet, for example, or that they can provably rebuild key systems in the face of adversity, and a whole array of other things we list in the PCAST report. If they can get those right, you almost can't help but be resilient. And the great thing as well, because we also talk about incentives in the report, if you also get those leading indicators right, you typically have more agility, you have more commercial effectiveness, you have more efficiency. And so you end up figuring out there's reasons to do these things that are not just for security and resilience, but deliver security and resilience. And we think that lines up with a lot of the incentives, again, to make sure that we're connecting the tone at the top to the resources in the ranks. So with that, I'll hand over to George to go through some more of the recommendations.
Thanks, Phil. Yeah, so one of the recommendations I want to talk about is actually one of my favorites. And there's a lot of great recommendations in the report, but it's what I consider to be one of the more bold recommendations. And that's the recommendation 2A, the establishment of a national critical infrastructure observatory. So what that means is sort of a digital twin of what all of critical infrastructure looks like from a resilience posture. In cybersecurity, you would say, what's the attack surface? But it's much more complex than just the cyber component of it. I know we talked, Phil and Eric both touched on the resiliency aspects of the report, but I just want to kind of compare it a little bit more to the cybersecurity piece and differentiate it. So in cybersecurity, you really put up your protections, hoping that you don't have an adversary get into the system, nothing happens. But with the National Critical Infrastructure Observatory, we're looking beyond an adversary getting into the system. It's what does the supply chain of the critical components look like? Are there sole source providers? If something like another Ukraine war happens where they're producing a critical element, how's that going to affect all of critical infrastructure? So it really does go beyond the cyber piece of it and looks at the entire ecosystem of those critical components. And one of the great things about the National Critical Infrastructure Observatory is it would become a belly button of understanding of how we look. We, in my opinion, I think a lot of other people's opinions, don't really have a good understanding of how that of what that looks like, and you could probably point to our adversary countries as having a better understanding of what that looks like. And again, on the cybersecurity side, I worked a number of years in cybersecurity test and evaluation, and I can tell you just on the penetration testing side, you have very, very busy teams that might come around to a system once a year, and they get the information for the system to go through and do their homework ahead of time to break into the system. They go in, they conduct their pen test, and they usually find the low-hanging fruit. They spend maybe 2 to 3 months researching this. They find that low-hanging fruit, your default password, they get into the system, and they cause a major effect of some type: denial, degrade, destroy, disable, whatever the effect may be. But when you look at what the adversaries are doing, they're not on a schedule of, okay, we're going to go by and look at that system once a year and we have 2 months to prepare. They're looking at those systems and these major systems within critical infrastructure for years. So they're following all aspects of it, not just the cybersecurity controls, but again, who are the suppliers? What are those critical components? What are the vulnerabilities within those critical components? Who are the folks, the contractors working on these systems? How can they make an effect there? So it really is a much larger effort, and we don't really have that kind of single belly button view of what the overall resilience posture looks like. And I think just like the examples that were given earlier, the CrowdStrike example that just I think is fresh on everyone's mind. You can see how one event, whether intentional or not intentional, has cascading effects throughout all of infrastructure. I was telling someone the other day that it deeply affected my mom and her access to Ancestry.com. So that's, once it hits that mainstream of my mom, I know that, okay, now the public is really picking up on this. So it's not a new issue, but I think it's an issue that is starting to be more understood by the wider general public that don't work in the cybersecurity field and are starting to see like, oh, everything is connected and there is this cascading ripple effect. So the National Critical Infrastructure Observatory would give us that baseline understanding. So I'm very excited about that recommendation. In the paper, we go through and identify how we could stand this up. Working with CISA and their National Risk Management Center in coordination with the sector risk management agencies and the NSA's Cybersecurity Collaboration Center, just working together to share the information, to put this together, and also throw out that since the report came out, the PPD 21 rewrite came out, and it identified some of our recommendations in there. They were echoed in there, like the minimal viable objective, which is a great recommendation and a first step to establish something like the National Critical Infrastructure Observatory, so you understand where those critical elements are, what you need to be performing. But in that report, it also identified that Homeland Security developed a strategy for resilience and security, and they also identified that the PCAST recommendations were needed. There was a call for a stand-up of a coordinating office, the coordination office under CISA, to be officially stood up within a year. And in my mind, that makes perfect sense to have that coordination office as the location where something like this would sit. So they're coordinating with the sector risk management agencies and having that information. So aside from the Critical Infrastructure Observatory that we recommended, again, I think a very bold recommendation to start to understand this baseline resilience posture. We also recommended research coordination amongst the different ARPAs out there. Everyone's doing great work, but to better coordinate and align what they're doing would benefit everyone. So you've got your Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, DARPA, you've got the Intelligence ARPA, you've got the Infrastructure ARPA, and the Health ARPA, and the Homeland Security Advanced Research Projects. All of these organizations are doing different things, but if they were to go through and again coordinate, share information, it'd bolster any type of outcome in there. And then one of the other aspects of the report that I really love is the recommendation for cyber-informed engineering. There's a strong engineering tone throughout the entire report, and I love that because having worked in cybersecurity for almost 30 years now, you hear the term bolt-on versus bake-in. This really becomes the baked-in. You talk to cyber professionals, and there's usually an issue with the requirements out there. Like the requirements might be, and make it cyber secure. Well, what does that mean? What does that mean, make it cyber secure? You have to actually provide specific recommendations, which then get to the engineering piece of it. So the cyber-informed engineering is really looking at a system and understanding what the consequences may be if there was some type of cyber attack, and try to mitigate that in the design. So before you design and then establish requirements, look at the design and red team it and see how you can go through and through a combination of your people, processes, technologies, mitigate some of those adverse effects that may happen if there was some type of issue. So in that cyber-informed engineering recommendation, we had recommended that the ABET certification look at that. And what I mean by that is the different engineering programs in the different universities, civil engineering, fire engineering, they don't necessarily require cybersecurity classes or understanding. So there's a big gap there between the engineers who are developing the systems and then what can actually then happen in those systems. Again, tying in some of the other recommendations like the minimal viable objective and knowing what you have to be able to do. If you include that in the engineering piece of it, then you start to build in the redundancy of those critical functions. You have the process in place. You've got your backup manual pieces that are there by understanding the entire process and what could happen to it to mitigate it. Since the report, in addition to talking to the ABET Commission on accreditation to discuss including cyber-informed engineering and some of these different engineering programs, I've also been working with the NSPE, the National Society of Professional Engineers, and the National Institute for Certification in Engineering Technologies on the development of a certification, SSI, which is software systems integration, or system software integration, excuse me. So it's a certification that starts to put that CIA flavor into understanding the effects of integrated systems, the Internet of Things, everything's so connected. What does that look like? Again, CrowdStrike, Log4j, just on the software side of things, there's these rippling effects. So on that integration side, what is the formal education and requirement that people have? So I'll take this moment to, I guess, solicit for people to look into the SSI certification. They're looking for people to beta test that certification, take the test, look at it, be an early adopter of it. Feel free to contact me. I'd be happy to put you in touch with the folks leading this effort, but it is a step in that integration of engineering and cybersecurity. So I think I've talked a lot about the engineering side of this, and I'll pass it back to John.
Thank you very much, and to everyone, because it's a great rundown of the report and just how complex that report is. We're starting to get a few questions in, but I want to, before I jump into those questions, I want to pull back on this observatory just for a minute. And really, I'm just going to ask the question, and please, any one of you that would like to chime in would be great. As I try to wrap my head around this observatory, right, there's a couple of things that make it kind of hard for me, at least, to get my head wrapped around it. I mean, first of all, we're talking about all the critical infrastructures. It seems like it's hard enough just to manage one. The second is it to look at kind of the interdependencies that we know exist? And there's a lot of potentially unknown interdependencies across critical infrastructures. And so I'm curious as to how you've kind of thought about these kind of potentially unknown interdependencies that might be there. And then the second or third piece to that is, what is the role for critical infrastructure providers and operators in that observatory? Would they be managing some of these digital twins that you talked about, George, or something like that? So I'll stop there and just hear from all of you.
Yeah, maybe
I'll
go ahead, Phil.
I was going to say, I mean, I'll be very, very quick just to make a couple of points and then let Eric and George chime in. Is, one of the things that we kind of mentioned before is worth reiterating is, in some of the discussions we had, we had various meetings with various government agencies, and it became clear, and we kind of knew some of this anyway, that our adversaries know more about our critical infrastructure and its weaknesses and dependencies than we collectively know of that ourselves. And that really informed the need for an observatory, for us to have the transparency on ourselves. I think, to your question, John, for me, the observatory would serve multiple purposes, but for me, one of the bigger points is to understand the dependencies we're not aware of. So if we understood how the internal dependencies of each critical infrastructure had, for example, on its supply chain, on its technology providers, on its component providers, and then also understand how each sector depends on each other, we kind of know from initial pilots that have been done on similar constructs in a much more isolated way, that always leads to the surprising discovery that who knew that if that one thing failed, it would have this impact. Again, just look at the recent impact of CrowdStrike. I mean, that was only on 1% of Windows machines, but it had a broader impact because of the very nature of the companies that happen to prioritize the importance of using security software. And when you start looking at an observatory and doing that kind of transitive closure of the dependencies, we inevitably will find things that we didn't know that we then have to go focus on.
Yeah, let me build on what Phil just said. I want to repeat this for the third time. We have good evidence that our adversaries have been spending quite a bit of time and effort on mapping out the complexity of our infrastructure across private and public providers. They know more than we. And just starting on an integrative approach to piecing together even an approximate set of interdependencies would be very valuable. We view this as a resource that would have both a cleared and uncleared set of interfaces and engagements, and it being core in red teaming our own infrastructure. Now, when we kicked off this study, I was fresh out of doing some of the first safety studies before GPT-4 was released, the large-scale language model. I was moving to AI here for a second. And this was like on the raw model before we had a chance to work through safety protocols, filters, fine-tuning, and so on. I was struck by the ability of the systems to be directed in a way that targets critical sensitive aspects of our national security. Of course, we worked on that as teams across OpenAI and Microsoft with GPT-4. But one thing that struck me in playing with these systems, and I think we're all becoming expert and proficient at what these models can do, which I think quite a bit of the capability is surprising to many of us, even to the creators of these systems, is that they're polymathic and can take a large-scale corpora or sets of databases and reason across them to come up with some creative ideas. And when I think about a red teaming critical infrastructure observatory service for researchers, national security experts, both in open R&D as well as in closed analyses, I think about the prospect of AI systems having the ability to do multi-point and sequenced attacks over time in a way to do maximal incursions and damage to the ability to provide services. In a time of crisis, this can be very disruptive psychologically to the United States. Of course, there's also the frank implications of losing access to services. And so as I just, again, continuing the AI thread, which we do have a call-out box in the report, as the capabilities of AI systems grow over time, we expect to see more intensive abilities to do planning and synthesis. And it's not clear that adversarial applications of these uses will have the same safety controls that we ship to consumers now. We need to understand what the implications are. We need to get there first to our digital twins to understand how to best protect, how to best understand dependencies, how to best bolster our resilience to continue with minimum viable delivery performance goals.
Yeah, and I'll jump in. I'm glad you said that, Eric. The minimal viable delivery goals is really key, I think, in the report, in the first step in all of our recommendations, because once the sectors understand, again, what they minimally have to do in a time of degraded state, what do they have to be able to provide, what services, what products, what capabilities, then you can start that understanding of the critical path of work that's required, technologies that are required, where your choke points are, where you have vulnerabilities. And then once each sector goes through and identifies that minimal viable capability and those critical components and functions required to meet that, then you have the basis of the National Critical Infrastructure Observatory to understand where we do have similar dependencies, and we start to discover those unknown dependencies. So it's sort of the first step. So I just want to make sure that everyone hears that recommendation, because it's also one that I love. And I'll also throw out the GRF, the Global Resilience Federation. They actually included the minimal viable product in their operational resilience framework under their, a lot of acronyms, BRC, their Business Resilience Council. So I'll point people to the GRF website to look at their operational resilience framework that really also starts to explore that minimal viable product or service.
No, this is extraordinarily helpful context, and I want to jump now to some of the questions that we're receiving in the chat. And I think what I'll do is I'm going to tie together a couple of similar questions that I've seen already pop into the questions, and part of this is just this concept of change, right? This concept of how fast critical infrastructure can change. How would we be able to keep up? And also incentives, right? The incentives for agile software development, moving software out very, very quickly, testing, and then trying to, how would, if patches are being rolled out, how can critical infrastructure providers, would that be the role of the observatory to test that, for example? Those are some of the types of, I think, that's the kind of underlying question that I'm seeing in some of the questions that have been posted in the chat.
Yeah, I'll touch on that agile software point. One of the things, I think there's a lot of tone in the industry about speed and agility not being compatible with security. And again, to kind of build on what we talked about on some of the leading indicator points, is we actually find that true if it's things are done poorly, but the right way to do software production, for example, in highly reproducible, high quality ways, with the ability to reproduce and deploy software almost continuously, like many organizations that have modernized their technology can do, has tremendous agility and commercial benefits back to the incentives, but also enables organizations to achieve security and resiliency goals more effectively and with more compatibility to the agility goals. So we think when organizations do that the right way, and there's plenty of evidence that organizations have and can do that. And one of the things this also requires organizations to have a little bit more skin in the game. And a good example is most organizations in their software have got these extreme dependencies on open source software. And so we've seen examples over the past few years of some critical vulnerabilities in open source that everybody's had to manage, whether it's Log4j or other things. And one of the responses to that has been some great industry initiatives like the Open Source Security Foundation and many other things that are radically improving how we manage the risks of open source. But unfortunately, you still see some organizations, and we've called a few of these organizations out. I won't do on this call, where the senior leaders of those organizations say we need to do more on improving the security of open source and our software supply chains and our critical infrastructure. And then you just go look up at the membership list of the Open Source Security Foundation or the Linux Foundation or all the established industry initiatives that are there to do things about that. And those organizations are not members and are not funding it. And I think my repeated theme of tone at the top with resources in the ranks, we have to have higher expectations of leaders of organizations that say security and resilience are important, to actually connect that to joining and funding the industry initiatives and actually putting some skin in the game.
Yeah, that's super helpful, Phil. And I wanted to shift gears maybe just a tad, as it goes to kind of the role of the private sector in all of this. And when I think of the private sector, you mentioned the sector coordinating councils earlier, and the role and the resources and leadership pieces, but not every sector is resourced the same way, right? I mean, the financial sector is a very well resourced sector within critical infrastructure. Other sectors are not. So how do we get those resources, the skills, the expertise, et cetera, that's going to be necessary to kind of make these types of resilience decisions that you've talked about in the report?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really important question, because you're right. There are some very well-resourced organizations and some organizations that are critical that are not that well-resourced. And one answer is the obvious one, which is they perhaps should be better resourced. But the reality is, as you all know, especially when you get into local water utilities, local electricity utilities that are not necessarily always commercially funded, they're funded under kind of local taxation and have commissions that oversee what they do. One of the things that we also identified in the report is the need to look at the 80-20 in supply chains. So when you look across all of these critical infrastructures, they're often underpinned by a small number of technology providers, software providers, and other providers. And if you can get them to improve their security, then that can have quite a widespread effect. And again, one of the things that we recommend in the report, in how government agencies and the sector coordinating councils prioritize what's critical in their sectors, they also look beyond what's in the sector to actually what's in the supply chains that underpin those sectors. Because often it is a small number of tech companies, a small number of cloud providers, a small number of software providers, a small number of hardware and service providers. And if you can get those organizations, and kudos to organizations like DHS for the Secure by Design pledge and some of the work that NIST has been doing and some of the work that other groups have been doing, you can get to that 20% of the critical infrastructure tech providers that underpin 80% of the critical infrastructure. You can have transformative effects quite quickly.
Yeah, I'll
George,
just add to that real
okay.
quick. Since we're talking about software, we also include in the paper the use of software bill of materials and advocating for people to have that transparency. It's not just the bugs that are in the software, the open source components, but who's developing. If you understand how software testing is done, it's you look at software and you identify the known issues with it, the known vulnerabilities. So if a vulnerability hasn't been discovered yet, there's no issue with the software, which doesn't really make a lot of sense. So if you have that transparency of okay, these are the components in there, and then you can start to see well, who developed these software components? Was this a Chinese hacker that put something in GitHub and then there hasn't been a known vulnerability discovered, so we're going to put it in there? Maybe it's just really well written, dormant and passive code that you're now injecting into your system that could cause an issue. So just having that transparency so that when you see that there's a log4j issue, you can understand, oh, okay, this is going to affect our system. And then throughout the entire critical infrastructure ecosystem, understanding, okay, now if we have these software bill of materials, we can see all these varied components. And I've described it as picturing that every critical infrastructure sector is made up of a Lego set, and then all of a sudden the yellow Lego is bad. Now you can see, oh, we've got yellow Legos everywhere. The adversary can see that too. So if you can get to those pieces, you can cause major disruptions, and transparency is key in understanding what that posture looks like in terms of resiliency if something would happen.
Yeah, and it's the theme that I'm starting to hear from everyone here is that hey, we've got to kind of execute these cybersecurity best practices, right? Whether it's software secure development, whether it's software bill of materials, and all of those pieces, they will also kind of lend that hand to kind of improving our overall resilience. I want to touch base for a second on this concept, and it's mentioned in the report, but we also have questions on it too. In the report, you talk about the cyber safety review board, and there's this really great quote that I like in there. It says we need that's necessary to have review boards to ensure that every catastrophic event only happens once. And so the question is actually a two-parter. The first is from one of the participants is, would the observatory be a way to help with this kind of post-incident assessment? Is that one of the conceptions that you have around that? And the other one is kind of the threshold that you see for when something would meet that threshold of needing a CSRB. Who wants to take that one on?
Yeah, I mean, I'll give it a shot. I mean, I think we quite heavily complement the work of the CSRB and the work that they've done, and I think the recommendation in the report is that the CSRB need to have more of a permanent staff of investigators so that they can do more of the work that they've been doing. And again, in that ability, just like you see with the NTSB and other similar constructs, that the more you can analyze events, the more everybody can have a practice of adopting better practices to mitigate that. It's almost like creating a digital immune system. You get one bad thing in one place, then everybody else can fix it. And the faster you get, the more you can stop attackers having wide-ranging effects. I think think the critical infrastructure observatory have a key role to play there, because if you identify a problem, you can quite quickly, by interrogating the observatory, understand where similar problems exist and then task resolution of that. I think some of the other existing public and private partnerships on information sharing also help. There's quite a lot of maturity out there in the so-called information sharing and analysis centers. Each sector and others have these ISACs. And I think, again, we are encouraging more of those to interconnect with this kind of incident learning feedback. So I think we've got, the good news is we've got the elements in place to let all of this happen more effectively. The thing we have to do is wire it together, with higher speed and higher fidelity.
I'm also excited. I'm excited about going back to leading versus retrospective, as much as the tools we talk about might be very helpful for John's comment and question. We ask for radical transparency about these measures of resilience, so that we could hold private and public utility providers, to their commitments, and point out measures that identify weaknesses in advance. I think we're moving. We put the CSRB discussion just now to cybersecurity and tightening the screws further to prevent attacks. We have to be thinking about resilience. We want to flow through these attacks with operational capabilities to continue. And you think about this, if we do that well, that is in itself a deterrent. If an adversary cannot create devastating effects with their attacks, but we just operate through, maybe it'll reduce the energy and enthusiasm about all that effort.
I'm so glad that you brought that point back up, Eric. You had mentioned that to me when we talked a couple of weeks ago, and it is something that I keep missing for some reason, and it's a really important point for everyone that's on this call, because there are going to be events, and the being able to, as you say, continue to power through is a completely different paradigm than zero failure kind of piece. And so I'm glad you mentioned that. There are several different questions about AI. Now, I lead the CyberAI project, so I think this is great. And when we look at AI, we look at AI in terms of how it could be helpful from, improving cybersecurity and those types of pieces. There are a lot of use cases where AI could be helpful, but other participants have also noted that, hey, this could actually amplify the attacks. It could create new novel means to those attacks. Eric, you've testified on this connection before, but maybe others have some thoughts too. So where does AI fit into all of this as you consider the report?
I'll just say a few words, since I've been public about my testimony on this. I'll pass it to Phil and George, but let me just say that I love people to look at my actual written testimony to the Senate Armed Services Subcommittee on Cybersecurity 2 Mays ago. But AI is certainly, just like in many other areas, whether it be biology, biosciences, it's dual use when it comes to security. And I think we have to basically look at it as an incredible platform for defense and scaling up our abilities to counter attacks and to understand them better. At the same time, we know that it'll reduce the cost of and scale up on the offender side. So I'll just make that statement. And I overall think that we have to be in the game. We have to be continuing to understand and red team the capabilities of adversaries to use AI to scale up their operations. And of course, we always say one of the weakest links is the human side of things. And these models are very good at understanding and influencing the minds of humans when it comes to this, one of the first padlocks into security of our cyber physical infrastructure. Let me turn it over to Phil and George, because again, I've been very vocal about this in the past, and I refer people to my documents on this.
No, I'd agree with that. I mean, on the whole, we generally and see most people now thinking that AI is going to deliver more advantage to cyber defenders and cyber resilience work than the risks that it brings. But of course, you still have to manage the risks that it brings. And so you've got to think about the security of the AI models itself. And there's a whole set of work there. In fact, a lot of large technology companies, we just created a thing called the Coalition for Secure AI under OASIS, which everybody's welcome to join. And that's about developing frameworks for how to make sure we're managing the security, trust, safety, and other risks of AI in more effective ways while still delivering on the benefits. But then when you also look at the potential for AI to drive increased capability in attackers, that's certainly something all of us are watching for. But the one thing it is worth kind of calling out is some of the early use cases of AI in attacks, like producing better phishing emails or trying to defraud people or impersonate people. Those are things that are scaling of existing attacks, but we know how to defend against those things. So like, for example, if we're worried about AI in improving attackers' capability to do phishing attacks, the answer to that is not really AI. The answer to that is implement phishing resistant cryptographic authentication technology, which we have to do anyway. And so I think sometimes we get caught up in AI risks magnifying attackers, but we should remember we've actually already got the defenses, and perhaps we should just knuckle down and implement those defenses, which we should have been doing anyway.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned that kind of phishing piece, because it reminded me, the UK put out a report, the NCSC put out a report not too long ago, kind of looking at this intersection of AI and how it would amplify pieces. Phishing is mentioned exactly. I would just highlight that to anyone that's kind of trying to consider. I think it's a really good unclassified available assessment that looks at the risk, the new risk, at least within a time horizon of the next 1.5 to 2 years. George, did you?
Yeah, I was just going to add on with the AI. We knew it was a big topic, so we actually included an appendix in the report on AI. It tried to keep it out of the main body since it was such a big topic on itself. So we do have that in there. And I also want to say AI. I think with both Phil and Eric, I can echo that it's going to be great, or it could be terrible. I tell people that once we are advanced artificial intelligence with quantum computing, we're in the days of the Terminator. So, it's kind of up to us right now to understand those risks, how it's being developed, how it's being implemented, where test and evaluation strategies are, and ensure that the policies are in place that people look at this. And just from a cybersecurity overlap with artificial intelligence, you can go through the NIST cybersecurity catalog 800-53, look at the controls, and there's a description of what the controls do, and they'll use different terminology in there to describe AI. It might be things like predictive technologies or automated mechanisms. A couple actually say artificial intelligence, some say machine learning. And so when you look at those specific controls, and then you look at the assessment processes on those controls, it never really gets to validate the trust of the AI system. So you kind of start with that an AI system that's generating something, and now you're putting protection on top of it. So there's a critical gap that may be emerging, that there's not the validation of the trustworthiness, the safetiness, the security of the AI itself, that you're inherently taking in and believing and trusting and adding your security to and moving forward. So there's work that needs to be done to sort of streamline that taxonomy and understanding where that overlap is.
Yeah, absolutely. The piece that I particularly like about the NIST risk management framework is something, again, that you all have kind of talked about, right? This is about managing risk. It's not saying eliminating it, it's about managing it, and it does lay out some really I think helpful steps that all organizations, whether they're in critical infrastructure or elsewhere, need
it does. But when it comes to AI, the RMF is really just looking at the data confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And
Yeah.
I guess you can start getting into deeper conversations on what integrity means, but it generally means that was sent and received in the same format, and it's the information you got, and it doesn't get to the root of, is it trustworthy information? Were the data models poisoned? Were there issues? Was there bias? So
Right.
you can, again, inherently corrupt an organization or a system by not fully having the transparency of what's taking place, or what the design of the AI was meant to do, and then how it's actually being operated.
Absolutely. And we've got about 5 minutes left. And so what I'd like to do, if I can, is just hit like maybe 4 or 5 topics in like maybe 1 minute kind of timeframes, if that's okay.
It feels like a game show.
I know. I'm sorry.
Gotta get a hold
It's
of our
been a
cards,
very,
you know? Yeah.
it's been a very rich conversation. So
Yes.
that's great. But maybe George, I'll start with you because you mentioned certifications, you mentioned education and those types of things. I'm curious, as you kind of the report also describes about layering in additional kind of education opportunities and those types of things. Did you look at things like scholarship for service, where people that go and get these kind of additional training and education then would potentially go to a sector risk management agency, for example, to fulfill the kind of scholarship that was paid off? Did you look at things like that, or did you consider any aspects of that?
Well, on the education side, we really got into again, the need for the cyber-informed engineering, the different programs. When we did our rollout event back in February on the paper, we had National Cyber Director Harry Coker with us, and he really pointed to a lot of the workforce development efforts that they're working on there to find talent in non-traditional ways. So maybe not formal education, but OJT, military spouses, other type of programs that you have talent, you can bring them in to bolster the workforce. But I don't think we really got into specific education requirements other than the cyber informed engineering piece of it.
Whoops, I've got to come off mute. So no, that's helpful. Another question that has been kind of raised is, what is the role for, I'll call it kind of this broad kind of auditing of capabilities, whether it would be models, whether it would be new software pieces that are put, and technologies that are kind of created that have both this kind of public and private piece. So I'll put audit evaluations, right? Evaluations and those types of pieces. Any consideration on that front?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is why a lot of the use of open source and open standards is really important in many of these areas. And so I think sometimes because of the some of the risks that have occurred in open source, it's occasionally got a bit of a bad rap. But when you look at some of the things that have happened in closed source systems, you get to see some significant vulnerabilities there. And although in open source and in open standards, when things have been subject to public and wide-ranging scrutiny, they generally get to improve. And there's been a lot of work amongst all of the big tech companies, the big chip companies, lots of organizations subjecting their products to open bug bounties, to hackathons, to research projects. I'll give you an example. Just last year, we had a very close partnership. For example, just to name one, there's myriad ones. I know Eric's teams at Microsoft have done similar things. We had a partnership with AMD where we did an open published research of discovering vulnerabilities in some of the processors, and those were discovered, disclosed, fixed, and that was in a very open process. We published a report on it, and then everybody could get to learn from that. So I think the work going on in the open source and open standards communities, I think, are providing great effect there. Arguably more so than if you go back a few decades and looking at some of the more kind of centralized government labs that analyzed and granted certifications to things. So I think there's probably still a place for that in some respects, but I think we should and can keep getting more value out of the open source and open standards world.
Great. Maybe I'll just give each of you 30 seconds to kind of just summarize anything that I should have asked that I missed in the headline in that piece, because again, it's a really deep report with a lot of different ones. There's discussions about grand challenges and those types of things, which I think are very intriguing as well. kind of close to what you were talking about just now, Phil, with the bug bounties and those types of pieces. But maybe I'll start with Eric. Any kind of closing thoughts for the audience?
Yeah, I think that we don't tend to think about resiliency as much as, and it might just be a human thing, as much as locking out and protecting and locking the door. And we have to sort of get into that mindset. It's a powerful one. It turns out there are threads of really interesting engineering as well as theoretical work in design and engineering and human factors that get at resiliency over decades. The prior work is locked up in literature that you have to sort of go look for, as opposed to being all in one place and integrative. I'd like to see new work built on the older work, standing on the shoulders of giants like John von Neumann, who even wrote a beautiful piece called "How Do You Build a Resilient System out of unreliable parts," for example. I mean, so there's been interesting research on this, notions of fail-safe design that have been implemented at multiple sectors, including defense, DoD, in many projects, that need to be brought together to become part of our education, be part of engineering programs, continuing education, and baked into our designs moving forward.
Thanks, Eric. George, any last thoughts?
Yeah, I was gonna reiterate the importance of resilience and having people understand that you need to be able to work through an issue regardless of what the issue is, and you probably sometimes don't even know what the issue may be coming from. In cyber, you might think, oh, it's a cyber attack or it's a maintenance issue, but then maybe it was a maintenance issue caused by a cyber attack and you didn't realize that. But as Eric was talking and kind of stole my answer, it dawned on me that we really didn't talk too much about operational technology, CPS metrics, and how important that is. So the establishment of different metrics on the OT side of the house versus the IT side of the house is very critical, and it's going to be the basic steps of understanding that baseline of normal activity, so you can start to see the indications and warning of things that are going to happen. So that's definitely a step that we need to take in and start establishing those metrics.
Yeah. Again, more of that complexity. Phil, the last word for you.
Yes, I'll just close on on the central part of the report on minimum viable delivery objectives, and that's absolutely key. And it sounds simple, but it's transformative when organizations do this. And I'll just close with one example, and some companies have done this. So think about a minimum viable operating capability for a bank. That is to make payments, get social security checks delivered, let people get cash and like buy groceries, and just that's that. They should be able to almost guarantee with high levels of assurance that can happen in all forms of adversity. But things like issuing a new mortgage, doing an M&A, doing a new IPO, doing some other fancy financial thing, that can get deferred for weeks, months, perhaps even quarters. And I think a lot of organizations in their conventional resiliency plans try to recover everything and end up having problems with the things that should be the core, absolutely survivable services. And so the report really is calling for every critical infrastructure to have, at the board level down, to have a essential understanding of what their minimum viable delivery goals are, and to really look at anything that can stop them doing that delivery and eliminate that and improve the resilience.
Great closing remark, Phil.
Yeah, it is a wonderful way to close this discussion. First of all, thank all three of you. I just can't tell you how much we appreciate you spending this time, and in fact, even going over a little bit of time. We know how busy you are, but also thank you for just highlighting this significant challenge in the report and in the PCAST piece. For our participants, the report is available. It's on the web page. It's on the White House webpage. You can find it very, very quickly and download it from there. Thank you to the audience for joining us, and to the panelists. Again, we appreciate the audience's questions, and I'm sorry that we did not get to them all. We will follow up soon with details about the next event that CSET will host. And in the meantime, you can sign up for additional updates and learn more about CSET at cset.georgetown.edu. We hope everyone had a good day, and we'll see you next time. Thanks, everyone.